It was a warm Friday afternoon in the summer of 2018 when 10-year-old Emily Parker climbed into her grandfather's old forest green pickup truck, her pink backpack bouncing with every step. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. She had been counting down the days to this trip for weeks. Grandpa Joe, a retired park ranger in his late 60s, had promised her a special weekend deep in the Pine Ridge Mountains, a place where he used to patrol and knew like the back of his weathered hands. It was their first camping trip alone together, something they both cherished and talked about often. Emily's parents waved them off from the driveway, smiling but slightly uneasy, as parents often are when their child leaves their sight. The sun dipped low as the truck wound its way up the narrow mountain roads, tires crunching gravel and stirring up little clouds of dust. Emily leaned out the window, trying to spot deer or rabbits darting through the trees. They arrived just before twilight at a small, secluded clearing by a creek, one of Grandpa Joe's secret spots, far from any marked trail. They pitched their tent together, cooked beans over a tiny fire, and shared ghost stories under a canopy of stars. Emily giggled as her grandfather made owl noises in the dark, and he chuckled, content just watching her wonder bloom in nature. As night fell fully over the forest, no one could have imagined it would be the last time anyone saw them. There were no signs of distress, no phone calls, no cries for help, only the calm, peaceful silence of the woods. That peaceful night would soon turn into a chilling mystery that would baffle authorities, fracture a family, and leave a community searching for answers that would remain buried for 7 long years. By Saturday evening, when Emily and her grandfather hadn't called to check in as promised, her parents began to worry. At first, they told themselves it was nothing. Maybe they were just out of cell service, maybe Grandpa Joe wanted to extend the trip by a few hours. But when Sunday morning came and still no word, panic began to creep in. By noon, Emily's father was on the phone with the local ranger station, explaining that his daughter and her grandfather were overdue from their trip into the Pine Ridge Mountains. Within hours, a search and rescue operation was launched, and the once quiet forest became a hive of activity filled with flashing lights, distant calls for names, and the whirl of helicopter blades. Volunteers from nearby towns joined professional search teams, combing the woods for any trace of the missing pair. Dogs trained to pick up scents were brought in, their handlers guiding them through dense brush and along the banks of creeks and ridgelines. The campground where they were believed to have stayed was located, and their tent was found, undisturbed, the campfire cold but showing signs of recent use. Emily's favorite hoodie was still draped over a camp chair, and 2 mugs sat on a log, each with a small amount of cooled cocoa inside. It looked as though they had simply stepped away for a short walk and never returned. Despite days of intensive searching, there were no footprints, no broken branches, no dropped items, nothing. Helicopters scanned from the sky with infrared sensors, and divers explored the nearby lake, hoping against hope to find something. But the forest remained eerily silent, as if it had swallowed them whole. With no leads, no evidence of foul play, and no vehicle found, the mystery only deepened. Each passing day brought fewer answers and more questions, leaving the family in a painful limbo, their hope slowly beginning to fade as the days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months, and still, there was no sign of Emily or Grandpa Joe. The search had officially been scaled back after 30 days, though local volunteers continued to walk the trails and check ravines on weekends, refusing to give up. Flyers with Emily's smiling face and Grandpa Joe's photo were posted in gas stations, ranger stations, and grocery stores across 3 counties. Her school kept her desk untouched for the remainder of the year, a quiet symbol of hope and heartbreak that none of her classmates truly knew how to process. Every now and then, a supposed tip would come in, a reported sighting at a highway rest stop, a piece of clothing found in the woods, but none led anywhere. Each false lead only reopened wounds that barely had time to begin healing. Emily's parents tried to hold on, tried to keep life going for the sake of their other child, a younger brother who didn't quite understand where his sister had gone. They worked with private investigators, hired drones, and even consulted a psychic at one point, desperate for anything that might point them in the right direction. Birthdays came and went without candles being lit, holidays passed with an empty seat at the table, and the once tight bonds of the Parker family began to strain under the weight of unending grief and unanswered questions. The community held vigils in the early days, lighting candles and releasing lanterns into the night sky, but even those began to fade as time dragged on. The story slipped out of the news cycle, replaced by fresher tragedies and new headlines, and the world seemed to move on, except for the ones who couldn't. The trail had gone cold, and in its place was a hollow ache, a mystery that sat heavy on the hearts of those who had known the pair. To many, it was as if the forest had claimed them and hidden its secrets deep beneath the trees. 7 years would pass before anyone even came close to understanding what had happened on that quiet, starlit weekend in 2018. 7 years later, the Pine Ridge region had changed. A new dam had been constructed just a few miles from the area where Emily and Grandpa Joe had disappeared. It was part of a larger flood control project designed to protect nearby towns from seasonal overflow. In the spring of that year, after an unusually wet winter and several weeks of steady rainfall, the reservoir behind the dam had reached near capacity. As water pressure mounted, engineers were ordered to open the secondary spillway, something that hadn't been done since the dam was built. It was supposed to be a routine release, part of standard safety protocol, but what they found during the inspection was anything but routine. As the water rushed through the spillway channels, it exposed rocks, tree limbs, and decades of debris that had been trapped beneath the flow. One maintenance worker, walking along the lower access path to monitor the release, noticed something unusual jutting out from the concrete divider, a rusted piece of metal that didn't look like it belonged there. At first glance, it appeared to be part of an old culvert or scrap equipment. But as more water cleared, it became unmistakable, a mangled, algae-covered SUV, wedged into a deep ravine where the spillway met a natural rock outcropping. Authorities were called immediately, and the area was sealed off. Rescue teams used winches and cranes to extract the crumpled vehicle, its tires bald and frame nearly eaten away by years of erosion and pressure. The roof had partially collapsed, windows were shattered, and nature had done its best to hide it, but the license plate was still legible. A quick check of DMV records confirmed the impossible. It matched the vehicle registered to Joseph Parker, the missing grandfather. Gasps echoed through the small team of officials, many of whom had worked the original disappearance. Years earlier, word spread quickly, and the Parker family was contacted. For the first time in 7 years, there was something concrete, something real, to hold on to. The forest had finally given up one of its secrets, and as investigators prepared to search the vehicle's interior, everyone knew this might be the key to finally understanding what happened on that long-ago weekend in the woods. When investigators carefully opened the corroded doors of the SUV, time seemed to stand still. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, but what they found silenced even the most seasoned professionals. In the front seat, partially reclined and still wearing what appeared to be the remnants of a ranger's jacket, were skeletal remains, later confirmed by dental records to be those of Grandpa Joe. Beside him, in the back seat, smaller remains were found curled up, as if seeking safety in her final moments. Emily's pink backpack was still in the vehicle, the fabric faded and water-stained but unmistakable, the little unicorn keychain on the zipper still hanging on. Inside the backpack were waterlogged notebooks, a small flashlight, and a pair of broken binoculars. But it was the camera found in the glove compartment that would later bring the greatest insight and heartbreak. The memory card, though damaged, was miraculously salvageable. Forensic technicians worked carefully to retrieve the data, and what they discovered added both clarity and tragedy to the story. The final photos on the card showed Emily and her grandfather smiling by the campfire, roasting marshmallows under a canopy of stars. One image captured them standing beside the creek, Grandpa Joe holding a fishing rod while Emily flashed a peace sign at the camera. The very last image, blurry and dim, appeared to have been taken from inside the SUV at night, fog covering the windshield, headlights illuminating a narrow, muddy path winding along the mountainside. Authorities now believe that after their night of camping, Grandpa Joe may have decided to take a drive to a scenic overlook he had once loved, despite worsening weather conditions. Somewhere along the way, possibly disoriented by heavy fog or a washed-out road, the vehicle slid off the narrow trail and tumbled down a steep ravine, straight into the natural rock basin that would later feed into the dam's spillway. The dense forest, rocky terrain, and remote location had hidden the wreckage for years, and the rising water from recent rains had finally dislodged it enough to bring it to light. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and reopened old wounds for the Parker family. But it also brought long-awaited closure. They finally knew what had happened. Emily and Grandpa Joe hadn't been taken, hadn't run away, hadn't vanished without a trace. They had simply been lost in the unforgiving wilderness, victims of a tragic accident and an indifferent landscape. The confirmation of the remains was both devastating and strangely comforting for the Parker family. After 7 years of agonizing silence, the truth had finally surfaced, offering a kind of closure they had long feared might never come. Emily's mother wept quietly in the coroner's office as the DNA results came in, her husband clutching her hand with a grip that trembled. There were no more what-ifs, no more desperate hopes for a miraculous return, no more endless scanning of crowds or half-hesitant phone calls every time a child was found wandering somewhere in the country. The finality was brutal, but it allowed grief to finally take its full shape. They could now mourn their daughter fully, without the cruel burden of unanswered questions. The town of Silver Ridge, which had once rallied in search of the missing pair, came together again, this time in somber remembrance. A memorial service was held at the town hall, the same place where missing posters had been handed out years ago, and now people gathered to honor 2 lives lost, but never forgotten. Emily's teacher from the 4th grade shared stories of her bright imagination and love for adventure. Grandpa Joe's former ranger colleagues remembered his quiet wisdom, his respect for the forest, and the pride he had taken in showing his granddaughter the world he loved. Tears flowed freely, not just from those who knew them personally, but from a community that had carried their story like a wound beneath the surface. The family chose to bury Emily and Grandpa Joe together, side by side in a quiet cemetery overlooking the valley. A simple gravestone was placed there, engraved with their names and the words, "Forever exploring, forever loved." People brought flowers, drawings, even a few stuffed animals and fishing lures, small tokens of remembrance from those who had followed the heartbreaking story since the beginning. Forensic investigators later shared their findings with the family in a final report. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence of struggle, only the cruel randomness of nature and weather. The fog, the slippery trail, the remote location, all had conspired to hide the accident for years. And though that knowledge did little to ease the pain of loss, it did restore something deeply needed, the truth. After all the wild speculation, false leads, and long nights haunted by uncertainty, the Parkers finally knew that Emily had not suffered alone. Her grandfather had been with her the whole time, by her side in the final moments, as he had promised he always would be. In the weeks following the discovery, investigators focused on piecing together exactly how the accident had occurred. Using topographic maps, archived weather data, and details from the camera's memory card, a clearer picture began to emerge. On the evening of their disappearance, dense fog had settled over the upper ridge of Pine Ridge Mountain, a phenomenon not uncommon in that region during seasonal weather shifts. It was likely that after spending a calm night at their campsite, Grandpa Joe had decided to take Emily on a short drive to a nearby overlook that offered panoramic views of the valley below. He had been a ranger in those mountains for decades, and the route would have been one he knew well. But familiarity can become a trap, especially when conditions turn treacherous without warning. The old access road they likely took was narrow, unpaved, and poorly maintained, an overgrown path rarely used since the Forest Service had rerouted major trails years before. What made it especially dangerous was its steep grade and crumbling edges, most of which were now covered in wet leaves and mud from the ongoing rain. With visibility reduced to just a few feet, Joe might not have realized how close he was to the edge until it was too late. Investigators estimated that the SUV had slipped sideways off a narrow turn, then tumbled nearly 200 feet down a hidden ravine before becoming wedged in a natural rock basin, where it remained unseen for all those years. The final blurry photo from the camera, timestamped just minutes before the likely time of the accident, supported this theory. The shot showed the dashboard lights glowing, fog pressing against the windshield like smoke, and faint outlines of trees passing by. That image haunted many of those who saw it, an almost cinematic last glimpse of 2 lives unknowingly approaching their tragic end. The fact that Joe had kept driving, probably thinking the road would level out or lead them safely home, added a painful layer of what-ifs. What if he had turned back? What if he had waited for the fog to lift? But the truth was, he had no way of knowing the path ahead would be their last. Engineers later confirmed that the position of the SUV in the rock basin, coupled with seasonal flooding over the years, explained why no one had found it sooner. It had been hidden under layers of silt and debris, in a location inaccessible by foot or sight from the air. The dam's spillway project, ironically designed to prevent disaster, had finally revealed the long-buried secret. For the Parker family, the reconstruction of events offered some peace. Knowing that it wasn't neglect or foul play, but simply a tragic accident under impossible conditions, helped ease the cruel speculation that had haunted them for years. Grandpa Joe had done what any grandfather would do, tried to share something beautiful with his granddaughter. He had simply trusted a path he knew, never imagining that nature itself would betray him. The camera's final images became more than just evidence, they became a window into the last hours of Emily and Grandpa Joe's lives, preserving moments of joy, wonder, and quiet connection frozen in time. Technicians had painstakingly recovered dozens of photos from the weather-worn memory card, and once restored, they revealed a bittersweet narrative. One photo showed Emily perched on a fallen log, laughing with her arms spread wide like she was flying. Another captured her crouching by the creek, studying a frog in her small hands while Joe stood nearby, smiling proudly. These weren't the images of two people in distress, they were the moments of a perfect day, a child discovering the wild under the watchful eye of someone who loved her deeply. In one particularly moving picture, taken by Joe himself, Emily stood next to their orange tent, a stick in one hand and marshmallow goo smeared on her cheek. The campfire crackled behind her, and the stars had just begun to shimmer in the dusk sky. She looked completely at peace, safe, happy, and utterly in the moment. It was a scene so full of life that it felt unreal to those who viewed it after the tragedy. These photographs were later printed and framed by the family, placed around their home not as reminders of loss, but as proof that her last day on Earth had been full of light. The final photo, though, was the one that gripped everyone's heart. It was blurry, taken from inside the SUV, Emily's small figure visible in the passenger seat, her head turned slightly as though looking out into the mist. The dashboard lights glowed faintly, casting a warm hue on her face, while the outside world looked like a ghostly void of fog and shadows. There was something unknowable in that photo, something fragile and haunting. No one could say for sure if the picture had been taken intentionally or by accident, but its existence told a story all its own. It marked the very edge of their journey, the moment just before everything changed. For the Parker family, those pictures became sacred. They offered answers that words couldn't, a narrative that death had tried to erase. Emily's mother kept the camera itself in a small wooden box on her nightstand, not out of morbid fascination, but as a link to her daughter's final adventure. She often said it felt like a message, not of fear, but of presence. That Emily had lived a full day of laughter, stories, and wonder before fate stepped in. That her final memories were ones of beauty, not tragedy. The community, moved deeply by the recovered images, established a small memorial trail near the area where Joe and Emily had likely driven. It was safe, well marked, and included benches and plaques featuring some of the photos from that last trip. At the trail's end, a carved wooden sign read, "In memory of Joe and Emily, who wandered into the wild, and stayed." It became a place of reflection, not just for the family, but for hikers, students, and neighbors who had carried their story for years. In the end, what was found in the dam's spillway was more than wreckage. It was the resolution of a mystery, the return of two beloved souls, and the unexpected gift of memory. It reminded everyone that while nature can be unforgiving, it can also, eventually, reveal its secrets, and in doing so, bring peace to the hearts left behind.